I still remember the way the rain fell that morning, sharp, unrelenting, washing the world in a gray I could almost taste. The kind of rain that makes you question your choices, your past, your hope. I stood at the bus stop, clutching the handle of my umbrella that had long since given up the fight, my other hand gripping the strap of my worn leather bag. Inside it were two things that mattered most: my daughter's lunchbox and the letter that would change everything. The letter was creased, a little damp from my fingers. It wasn't from a friend or a bank or the school. It was a job offer, my first one in months. A cleaner at a mansion outside the city. I'd been out of work for almost a year, surviving on whatever I could piece together after my husband left. No, not left. Vanished. One morning he said he was going out to get milk, and by nightfall, I realized he wasn't coming back. That was 2 years ago. I don't talk about him anymore, not even to Lily. She's only 8, with a kind of innocence that makes me both proud and terrified. She still asks sometimes, in her quiet voice, where Daddy went. And I still lie, telling her he's working somewhere far away. I tell her lies to protect her, though sometimes I wonder if I'm really protecting myself. When the bus finally came, I climbed aboard, shaking off the rain. My reflection in the window stared back, tired eyes, hair pulled into a loose bun, cheap lipstick doing its best to hide exhaustion. I was 34, but I felt 10 years older. The mansion was in a place I'd never been before. The kind of neighborhood where the streets have names like Whispering Oaks and Silverwood Lane. The gates were taller than any building I'd ever lived in. When they opened for me, I felt like I was stepping into another world, one I didn't belong in. The man who answered the door wasn't the owner. He introduced himself as Mr. Lang, the estate manager. Stern, well-dressed, not a hair out of place. He glanced at my resume like it was an inconvenience. "You've done housekeeping before?" he asked, though the answer was already printed on the paper he held. "Yes," I said, trying to sound confident. "Mostly private homes, a few hotels. And you understand discretion is very important here." "Of course." He led me through halls so wide I could have driven Lily's bike through them. The floors gleamed like glass. A chandelier above us sparkled with rainbows. I tried not to stare, but I'd never seen anything like it. And then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the hall, talking quietly with a woman in a navy suit. Even from a distance, he had presence. Tall, calm. The kind of man who made space bend around him. When he turned slightly, the light caught his face. And I froze. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But no. Fat jawline, those eyes, colder now, sharper. There was no mistaking them. It was him, Ethan Cole, the man I once loved, the man who had broken my heart, the man who didn't know I had his child. I almost turned and ran. My legs went weak, and I gripped the cleaning cart for balance. What are the odds, I thought. After years of hiding, after everything I'd built to protect my daughter, fate had led me straight into his home. "Are you all right?" Mr. Lang's voice cut through the air. "Yes, sorry," I stammered. "Just dizzy from the rain." He moved on, not noticing that my hands were trembling. As I followed him through the house, I kept stealing glances, praying Ethan wouldn't look my way. But he didn't. He was too absorbed in whatever business he was discussing, his expression unreadable. Still, part of me ached at the sight of him. That familiar silhouette, the way he held himself. Memories flooded back. Late nights in college, his hand in mine, promises whispered under the stars. And then, the letter that ended it all. I'd never told anyone why we broke up, not even my closest friend, because to tell it would be to relive it, and to admit that I had walked away carrying something he never knew about. That first day, I worked quietly, cleaning rooms that looked like they belonged in magazines. I polished silverware worth more than my rent. I made beds that no one seemed to sleep in. The mansion was both alive and empty, full of light, but cold to the touch. At lunch, I sat in the staff kitchen, sipping lukewarm tea. The other cleaners were kind but distant. Most of them were older, long-time employees who spoke in hushed tones about Mr. Cole, like he was a ghost who might appear if you said his name too loudly. They said he rarely smiled, that he'd built his tech empire from nothing, that he was widowed young, or maybe divorced, depending on who you asked. No one seemed to know for sure. I did. He wasn't divorced. He was the kind of man who never looked back once he walked away. When the clock struck 5, I took the bus home to our small apartment. Lily ran to the door as soon as I opened it, her eyes bright. "Mummy, did you get the job?" I nodded, smiling despite the ache in my chest. I did. She squealed and threw her arms around my waist. I lifted her, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, strawberries and innocence. I didn't tell her where I'd be working. Not yet. Some truths are too dangerous, even for an 8-year-old heart. That night, after she was asleep, I sat by the window, the rain tapping softly on the glass. My reflection looked back at me, part relief, part fear. What if he recognizes me? What if he doesn't? Which would hurt more? And, deeper still, was another fear, one I'd buried for years. What if he finds out about Lily? The next morning, I arrived early. The mansion was quiet, except for the soft hum of distant music. I followed the notes to the main hall, where a grand piano stood beneath a skylight. The music wasn't coming from a speaker. It was real, played by someone with precision and passion. It was Ethan. He sat at the piano, his sleeves rolled up, eyes closed, completely lost in the melody. The sound filled the air like a confession, raw, beautiful, lonely. I stood frozen in the doorway, every nerve alive. I wanted to step closer, to tell him I remembered that song, the one he used to play for me on Sunday mornings. But I didn't. I couldn't. When he finished, the silence was almost painful. He turned slightly, and our eyes met. For one heartbeat, time stopped. His gaze narrowed, like he was trying to place me. Then he gave a polite nod, nothing more, and returned too. Maybe he didn't recognize me after all. Maybe that was for the best. By the third day, I learned the rhythm of the house. When the staff rotated, when Mr. Cole left for his meetings, when the halls were safe to breathe in. I avoided him as much as possible, but fate has a cruel sense of humor. I was dusting the study when he walked in unexpectedly. He stopped when he saw me. I froze, feather duster in hand. "Sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't realize anyone." He raised a hand slightly. "It's fine. Carry on." His voice was calm, deeper than I remembered. I nodded, pretending to focus on the bookshelf, though my hands were shaking. He studied me for a moment. "You're new." "Yes, sir." "What's your name?" I hesitated. "Anna." It wasn't a lie. It was my middle name, the name I used when I wanted to disappear. He nodded slowly, eyes lingering on my face. "Have we met before?" The air caught in my throat. For a split second, I thought he'd seen through me, but I forced a smile. "I don't think so, sir." He watched me a moment longer, then turned away, picking up a file from his desk. "Very well. Welcome aboard." As he walked past me, I caught the faint scent of his cologne. Clean, familiar, heartbreak in a bottle. When he left, my knees nearly gave out. That night, I dreamed of the past. Of the first time we met. Me, a scholarship student working part-time at the campus library. Him, the golden boy with a future written in stars. He used to leave notes for me and returned books. Silly things, like "You looked beautiful today," or "Coffee after your shift." I'd play along, pretending to scold him for defacing university property. We were young, reckless, in love. And then, one morning, it all ended. He'd gotten an offer to intern in another country, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I told him I'd wait, but weeks later, I received a letter from his assistant, not from him. It said he wouldn't be coming back, that he wished me well. I never saw him again, until now. On Friday, something changed. He called for me. Mr. Lang appeared at the staff entrance, his usual stoic expression replaced by something curious. "Mr. Cole would like to see you in his office," he said. My stomach dropped. Me? Yes. He said specifically, "The new cleaner, Anna." As I followed him down the hall, my thoughts spiraled. Had he recognized me after all? Did I do something wrong? The memory of that letter, the one that broke me, burned in my chest. When I stepped into his office, he was standing by the window, hands in his pockets. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Anna," he said softly, "close the door." My fingers trembled on the handle. I shut it behind me. For a long moment, he just looked at me, studying, searching. Then, almost to himself, he said, "You remind me of someone I used to know." I forced a small laugh. I get that sometimes. He tilted his head slightly, still watching me. "Do you?" Because I don't believe in coincidences. My heart pounded. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Then, a knock on the door. Mr. Lang entered, holding a tablet. "Sir, the investors from Zurich are on the line." Ethan nodded once. "I'll be right there." He turned back to me, eyes unreadable. "You can go for now, Anna, but I'd like to speak again soon." I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "Of course, sir." When I stepped out into the hall, I realized my hands were still shaking. He didn't remember me, not yet. But something in his voice told me he was close. Too close. Mornings in our little apartment were always the same. The smell of instant coffee, the faint sound of cartoons drifting from the living room, and Lily's laughter as she tried to braid her hair by herself in the mirror. It wasn't much, but it was ours. A fragile world built from routine and love. Our apartment was small. One bedroom, a kitchen that doubled as a dining room, and a balcony where I kept 2 potted plants that somehow refused to die. Every morning before work, I'd step out there with my cup of coffee, look at the sunrise, and tell myself everything would be fine, even when I didn't believe it. Lily was the reason I kept moving. She had this way of making the world seem brighter, even when mine was falling apart. Every day before school, she'd kiss my cheek and say, "Don't worry, Mommy. One day we'll have a house with stairs." And I'd laugh, pretending it was a silly dream, though deep down, I'd picture it too. A home that didn't smell like paint, where the walls weren't thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing. That morning, as I packed her lunch and buttoned her jacket, I felt that familiar pull in my chest, the quiet fear of losing what little stability we had. My new job paid just enough to cover rent and school fees. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hope. The bus ride to the mansion always felt like crossing into another life. I'd watch the city shrink in the window, the traffic, the noise, the gray buildings, until everything turned to open roads and manicured lawns. By the time I reached the gates of the Cole estate, I was someone else entirely. A cleaner, invisible. Someone who could move through opulence without leaving a trace. The staff had started warming up to me, at least a little. Mrs. Perez, the cook, was a round, kind woman with a laugh that filled the kitchen. She'd saved me from scrubbing the same marble counter twice. "You'll wear a hole in it, sweetheart," she joked, handing me a slice of banana bread. "First week nerves," I told her, smiling. She winked. "Give it time. You'll learn the rhythm of this house." She was right. The mansion had a rhythm, a quiet hum beneath its grandeur. You could tell what time it was just by the sounds. The gardener's tools in the morning, the chef's clatter by noon, the echo of footsteps in empty corridors by dusk. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the sound of him, Ethan Cole, moving through his empire like a ghost, who still had things left unfinished. He wasn't always there. Some days I wouldn't see him at all. But when I did, it was like the air shifted. The staff straightened up, their conversations clipped mid-sentence. Even the silence seemed to listen. I told myself to avoid him, to do my job, collect my paycheck, and go home. But the universe doesn't care about plans. It was a Thursday when it happened. I was in the West Wing, dusting the hallway near the gallery. The walls were lined with paintings, cityscapes, abstract colors, and one old photograph that always caught my eye. A young couple, standing under a willow tree, smiling as if they had the world ahead of them. The woman looked almost like me. I was staring at it again when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was. Ethan. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly, his gaze following mine to the photograph. I nodded, my throat dry. "It is." He walked closer, hands in his pockets. "My parents," he said. "That photo was taken before my father's company went bankrupt, before everything changed." I hadn't expected him to share that. There was a softness in his voice I'd never heard before. "I'm sorry," I murmured. He gave a faint smile. "Don't be. Failure's a good teacher. Pain even more so." There was something about the way he said it, calm but heavy, like he'd carried that truth for too long. Then his eyes met mine. And for a fleeting second, it felt like the years between us had vanished. "I've seen you before," he said. "Not here. Somewhere else." My heart skipped. "Maybe you've seen me in town." "Maybe." He studied me, the corners of his mouth softening. "You just have one of those faces, I suppose." He walked away before I could respond, leaving the faint scent of cedar and rain behind him. I stood there long after he was gone, staring at that photograph, wondering if the universe was mocking me or giving me another chance I wasn't ready to take. That afternoon, the mansion was unusually quiet. The rest of the staff had gone home early because of a storm warning, but I'd stayed behind to finish the library. It was my favorite room. Rows of old books, warm amber lamps, and a large window overlooking the garden. When it rained, the sound against the glass felt almost like a heartbeat. I was wiping down the table when lightning flashed outside, followed by a rumble of thunder. The lights flickered, then went out. "Perfect," I muttered, reaching for my phone's flashlight. That's when I heard footsteps again. Slow, deliberate. "Still here?" His voice came from the doorway, smooth but surprised. I turned to see Ethan holding a glass of whiskey, the stormlight cutting across his face. "I was finishing up," I said. "Didn't realize the power was out." He chuckled softly. "It happens. The generator will kick in soon." He walked over, setting his glass down on the desk. "You shouldn't be working alone during a storm." "I'd fine," I said, forcing a small smile. "Rain doesn't scare me." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Brave woman." We stood there, the sound of rain between us, the dim glow from my phone lighting half his face. It was strange. We were two people surrounded by silence, and yet the air felt charged. "Would you like a drink?" he asked suddenly. I blinked. "Oh, no thank you. I'm working." He tilted his head, amused. Always the responsible one. It was such a small remark, but it hit me. The phrasing, the tone, like something he might have said years ago. My heart clenched. He didn't know how right he was. A generator hummed back to life. Warm light filled the room again. I could see him clearly now, his expression calm, but his eyes tired, the kind of tiredness that money couldn't fix. I picked up my cleaning cloth, eager to escape before my emotions betrayed me. "Good night, sir," I said softly. He nodded, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. "Good night, Anna." As I walked away, I felt the weight of his eyes follow me, not in a possessive way, but like a question that hadn't been asked yet. The next few days, something in me shifted. I told myself it was nothing, a passing moment, a memory sparked by his presence. But each morning when I stepped into the mansion, I caught myself glancing toward his office door, listening for his voice in the hallways. And sometimes I'd find small traces of him, a book left open on the piano, a coffee cup half full, a forgotten pen. Each object felt like a breadcrumb leading me back to the person I once knew. Yet the man he'd become was harder, quieter, wrapped in the kind of solitude that success demands. And still, when he smiled, rarely, fleetingly, I saw the boy I'd loved. One afternoon, Mrs. Perez sent me to the garden with a tray of coffee. "Mr. Cole's working outside," she said. "Be polite. He's in one of his moods." The garden was bathed in sunlight, a rare break from the rain. Ethan sat beneath a pergola, laptop open, phone pressed to his ear. He looked up as I approached. "Thank you," he said, nodding toward the tray. I set it down carefully, trying not to spill anything. "Do you want me to bring anything else?" He shook his head. "No, just this." As I turned to leave, he said, "Anna, stay for a minute." I froze. "Sir?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please." My instincts screamed to keep my distance, but something in his tone, gentle, almost weary, made me sit. He closed his laptop, leaning back. "You're new, but you don't seem intimidated by this place." "Most people are." I smiled faintly. "Marble floors don't scare me," he chuckled. "That makes two of us." For a moment, we just sat there, a sound of wind rustling through the leaves. I noticed how his sleeves were rolled up, how his watch gleamed in the light, how the faint stubble on his jaw made him look less like a billionaire and more like the boy I'd once known. "Do you ever miss before?" I asked suddenly, not sure why. He raised an eyebrow. "Before what?" "Before you had all this." I gestured vaguely toward the mansion, the endless green lawn. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Every day." It was such a simple answer, but it hit me harder than I expected. Because I missed before, too. The time when love felt enough. When promises still meant something. He looked at me again, and this time his expression softened. "You remind me of someone," he said, echoing his words from before. "Someone who made life simpler." I forced a smile, though my chest tightened. "She sounds lucky." He looked down at his coffee. I wasn't. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden. We sat in silence, both of us lost in memories neither dared to share. When I finally stood, his eyes followed me. "Thank you for staying," he said. "I don't talk to people much these days." "Maybe you should," I replied softly. "It helps." He smiled faintly, and this time it reached his eyes. That night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she looked at me with that knowing little smile of hers. "You're smiling, Mommy." "Thought." "I am?" She nodded. "You only do that when something good happens." I laughed. "Maybe something good did happen." She grinned. "Did someone give you flowers?" "No, silly," I said, kissing her forehead. "Just a good day." But after she fell asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Because something had shifted. Not a grand, sweeping change, just a quiet spark, like the first note of a song you haven't heard in years. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. But the truth was, the mansion no longer felt like just a place I worked. It had become something else, a bridge between the woman I was and the one I might be again. The next morning, I arrived early again, just as the sun was rising. The garden glistened with dew. I walked to the back entrance, humming under my breath. When I reached the main hall, I heard it. Music. The same song from before. The one he used to play when we were young. I followed the sound to the piano room. He was there, sitting just as he had that morning in Act 1, his fingers gliding over the keys. But this time, he wasn't alone. He looked up as I entered. a faint smile touching his lips. "Good morning, Anna." "Good morning, sir." He nodded toward the piano. "Do you play?" I hesitated. "A little. Not like that. Everyone can play something," he said, "even if it's just one song." He slid over slightly, leaving space on the bench. My heart thudded. "Come on," he said, voice soft but insistent. "Humor me." I sat, nervous, the warmth of him beside me. My fingers hovered over the keys, and before I knew it, I was playing. A simple melody, shaky at first, then steady. He joined in quietly, matching my rhythm. The notes filled the room, wrapping around us like a memory brought back to life. When the last note faded, we both sat there in silence. He looked at me, really looked, and for a moment, I thought he might say my name. My real name. Instead, he whispered, almost to himself, "It's strange. I feel like I've known you for a lifetime." I smiled faintly, my heart breaking in slow motion. "Maybe in another life," I said. He nodded, still watching me. Maybe. That night, as I washed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. There was a softness in my face I hadn't seen in years. A light I thought I'd lost when Ethan left. But it wasn't love. Not yet. It was recognition. A fragile reminder of who I used to be. And though I tried to fight it, I knew deep down that something inside me had started to wake up. Something that couldn't be undone. After that first, unexpected conversation in the mansion's garden, something inside me had shifted, quietly, like the subtle turn of wind before a storm. I didn't know it then, but that single moment would begin to change the rhythm of my days. The following week, I found myself moving through the mansion differently. My footsteps felt lighter, my reflection in the marble floors less tired. It wasn't because of anything he had said. It was the way he had listened, the way his eyes had softened when he asked about my daughter, like he genuinely cared. Not out of politeness, but out of some deeper understanding. Every morning, I still arrived early, long before sunrise painted the horizon. The mansion stood quiet then, the chandeliers dark, the smell of last night's rain drifting through the open hallways. I loved that hour. It made me feel as though the house belonged to no one, not even him, just a vast shell filled with echoes and possibility. But now, even in that silence, I caught myself wondering, will I see him today? It wasn't a conscious thought at first, more like a warmth that lingered at the edge of awareness. I told myself it was just curiosity. He was, after all, the most intriguing person I'd ever met. Still, I noticed things I hadn't before. The half-empty glass on his desk, the books by the piano, the faint traces of coffee he left on the counter. It was strange how his presence seemed to exist everywhere, even when he wasn't there. And then, one morning, he was. I had been wiping down the kitchen island when I heard the creak of the door behind me. "Up early again?" His voice was softer this time, touched by sleep. I turned, startled, though I tried to hide it. He was standing by the doorway, barefoot, wearing a gray t-shirt that looked far too ordinary for a man like him. His hair was slightly messy, and for a second I saw him not as a billionaire, but as someone human, someone almost vu. "I could ask you the same," I said quietly, trying to sound casual. He smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." There was a pause, not awkward, just still. I reached for another rag, pretending to focus on the counter, but I could feel his gaze. Not intrusive, just curious, almost searching. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked after a moment. I was just about to make some for myself. He raised an eyebrow, amused. "You drink the same coffee as the staff?" I smiled a little. "I am the staff." He laughed then, genuinely, and the sound filled the kitchen in a way that felt unexpectedly intimate. "Then let's have the staff coffee," he said, walking over to the counter. We sat together at the small table by the window, steam curling from our mugs. Outside, the world was still gray and half asleep. He asked about my morning routines, about my daughter, about little things that most people overlooked. And when I answered, he listened. Really listened. It was disarming. At some point, he told me about his insomnia, how he often walked the halls at night, trying to quiet a mind that never seemed to stop working. You'd think, he said, that having everything means you can finally rest. But sometimes it's the opposite. I looked at him then, really looked, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the weight behind his charm. The kind of loneliness that comes from living too long behind walls of your own making. I wanted to say something kind, something human, but instead I just nodded. Maybe that's why you built a house this big, I finally said softly, so your thoughts would have space to wander. He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled, not the polite kind, but the kind that reaches the eyes. Maybe, he whispered. Days turned into weeks, and those quiet early morning coffees became our secret routine. No one else knew, not the other staff, not the driver, not even my daughter. Sometimes we'd talk about nothing. Weather, music, the books on his shelves. Other times, he'd tell me stories from his childhood, and I'd find myself laughing at the small details. Like how he once tried to fix a broken radio with chewing gum. There was a gentleness in those moments I hadn't felt in years. He never treated me like a cleaner, never looked at me with pity. In fact, he seemed to forget my uniform altogether. When he spoke, I felt seen, not as a woman who had lost too much, but as someone still capable of wonder. One evening, after my shift ended, I found a small note tucked under my cleaning supplies. You missed a spot, the one by the piano. Come find it tomorrow morning. A. I smiled before I could stop myself. The next day, curious, I went to the piano room. A single rose lay across the keys, its petals deep red against the white and black. He was standing by the window, pretending to check his phone. You missed that, he said without looking up. I walked over, picking up the rose. I'm not sure this counts as dust. He looked at me then, eyes soft, lips curved in that quiet smile I was starting to recognize. No, he said, that's for you. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a gift wrapped in diamonds or some extravagant promise. But somehow, that single flower meant more. For a second, I wanted to ask why. Why he was being kind. Why he kept seeking my company. But I didn't. I just let the silence stretch between us, filled with something unspoken and fragile. Over the next few weeks, that fragile thing grew roots. He started finding excuses to be around when I worked. Sometimes he'd ask for help choosing a painting for his office. Other times, he'd wander into the kitchen when I was cleaning, pretending he just happened to be hungry. You're terrible at pretending, I told him once, and he grinned like a child caught stealing cookies. Maybe, he said, but you're terrible at ignoring me. He wasn't wrong. I tried to tell myself it was harmless. Two lonely people sharing moments in a house too big for either of them. But then came the afternoon by the garden fountain. It was a warm day, sunlight spilling through the tall windows, dust glittering like tiny stars in the air. I had been scrubbing the marble edge of the fountain when I noticed him watching from the terrace. He walked over, hands in pockets. You know, I've lived here for years, and I've never seen this fountain actually clean. Then you've been missing out, I said, wiping my hands on my apron. He laughed softly. You're not like anyone I've met before. I froze. What does that mean? He hesitated, then shrugged. Most people in my world, they talk a lot, but say nothing. You say little, but mean everything. I didn't know what to say to that. I looked away, focusing on the water rippling under the sunlight. Maybe that's because I don't have time for pretending. He nodded, almost solemnly. Maybe that's what I've been missing. Something shifted in that moment. Quiet, invisible, but unmistakable. Like a thread had been pulled loose between us. The bond deepened. He started driving me home sometimes, saying it was on his way, though I knew it wasn't. He'd wait for me while I said goodnight to my daughter, waving at her from the car. She'd giggle every time, asking who the nice man in the fancy car was. I told her he was just my boss, but even as I said it, the word boss felt wrong. He began sharing pieces of himself I hadn't expected. How his father had died young. How his success came at the cost of friendships he never mended. How sometimes, when he stood on the balcony overlooking the city, he still felt like that boy who didn't belong anywhere. And I listened, not out of sympathy, but because I understood. I told him about the nights I'd spent counting coins to pay rent, about the fear of raising a child alone, about the guilt that clung to me after my husband left. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just reached across the table one evening and touched my hand, lightly, as if asking for permission. That single touch unraveled something inside me. It wasn't fireworks or drama. It was quiet recognition, like two lost souls realizing they'd been walking parallel roads all along. But perfection never lasts. It started small, tiny cracks in the glass. One evening, I came to work and found the mansion unusually silent. The staff whispered among themselves, eyes darting toward the study door. When I asked what was going on, no one answered. He didn't come out all day. When I finally saw him late that night, his expression was unreadable. The warmth I'd grown used to was gone, replaced by distance. "Rough day?" I asked gently. He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Something like that," he said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I wanted to ask what was wrong, but the air between us felt different, colder somehow. So I stayed silent, pretending to clean while my heart ached quietly. Later, when I left the house, I saw him standing by the window, staring out into the dark. He didn't move, didn't notice me watching. Something had shifted, and not in a way I understood. The next few days were uneasy. He still greeted me, still smiled, but something about his rhythm had changed. He started taking calls I never heard before, disappearing for hours. Once I walked past the study and heard him arguing with someone, his voice sharp. Nothing like the calm tone I knew. When I entered to clean later, the room smelled faintly of cologne and anger. Still, when he saw me, he softened. "Sorry," he murmured, "not your mess to worry about." But I did worry, because it wasn't just his world that was shifting. It was mine too. I had started to care more than I should have, and that scared me. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed our conversations in my head. The laughter, the warmth, the little moments that had felt so pure. I wanted to believe they still meant something, but deep down, I knew something was changing. And for the first time, I felt the quiet edge of fear, not of losing my job, but of losing whatever this fragile thing between us had become. One morning, I found him in the garden again, standing by the same fountain where we'd laughed weeks before. The air was cool, the sky pale with early light. He looked tired, older somehow. "Are you all right?" I asked softly. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the water. "Do you ever wish," he said finally, "that life could stay simple?" I hesitated. "All the time." He turned to me then, and there was something raw in his expression. Something that almost frightened me. "Then hold on to that," he said quietly. "Because the world has a way of taking simple things and turning them into something else." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with a strange chill in my chest. I didn't know what he meant. Not yet. But his words stayed with me, like a whisper I couldn't quite shake. That night, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she asked if I was okay. I smiled, said I was fine. But even she noticed. Because beneath the warmth of what we'd built, a shadow had begun to grow, subtle but real. And though I didn't want to admit it, I could feel it coming. Whatever peace I had found in that mansion was about to break. I wanted to believe we were still the same. Two souls finding light in the dark. But that night, as I lay awake, listening to the rain, I felt it, the shift. Something was coming, and it would change everything. He had told me once that simple things never stayed simple for long. I didn't understand it then, but in the weeks that followed, I finally would. At first, the changes were so small, I almost convinced myself I imagined them. A delayed reply, a conversation cut short, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He started missing our morning coffees. Then the evening walks stopped. When I did see him, he seemed distracted, his mind miles away, his eyes drawn to something invisible. One morning, I found the rose he'd once given me, dried and brittle on the piano. I reached for it, but the petals crumbled at my touch. It shouldn't have meant anything, and yet it did. That afternoon, I overheard the housekeeper whispering in the hallway. "Did you hear? He's not taking calls again. The board's been trying to reach him all week. I heard there's a woman, someone from before." They went quiet when I walked past, but it was too late. Their words lingered like ghosts. A woman, from before. That night, I tried not to think about it. I told myself people loved to gossip, especially about men like him. But when I closed my eyes, I saw her anyway. A face I'd never met, a name I didn't know, but real enough to hurt. A morning, the mansion felt colder. He was in the study, papers scattered across his desk. I knocked gently on the door. "Come in," he said, without looking up. I hesitated. "I brought your coffee." He glanced up then, eyes tired, a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. "Thank you." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. Finally, I asked softly, "Are you okay?" He nodded, too quickly. "Just work." But his hands trembled slightly when he took the cup. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and yet I couldn't ask. I just stood there, holding the silence between us, like something fragile that could break with one wrong word. When I left the room, I heard him sigh, a sound of exhaustion, not from work, but from something heavier. A few days later, it happened. It was late. Most of the staff had gone home. I was in the hallway, locking the linen closet, when I heard voices from the library. His voice, low, tense, and another, a woman's. I froze. The door was slightly ajar. "I told you," the woman said sharply. "You can't hide forever." His reply was quiet, almost pleading. "It's not like that." "Then what is it, Alexander? You disappear for months, and when you finally resurface, you're playing house with the maid." My heart stopped. The maid. That was me. My hands went cold, the keys slipping from my fingers. They hit the floor with a faint metallic sound, and both voices fell silent. I turned to leave, but the door opened before I could move. He stood there, expression caught between surprise and guilt. Behind him, the woman appeared, tall, poised, beautiful in that effortless way I could never be. Her eyes swept over me, assessing. "So this is her," she said. "Claire," he started, his voice low, warning. But she ignored him. "You must be the cleaner. He's always been good at collecting strays." Her words burned. I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. He stepped forward. "That's enough." "Is it?" she snapped. "You think you can erase everything that happened just by hiding behind someone new?" He looked at her, and in that silence, I saw something that shattered me. Not love, but history. Something I couldn't compete with. "I think you should go," he said finally. She gave a small, bitter laugh. "You'll never change, Alexander." Then she walked out, perfume lingering in the air, long after the sound of her heels faded. He turned to me. "It's not what you think." I stared at him, my throat tight. "Then what is it?" He hesitated, just long enough for the truth to sink in. "Someone I used to know," he said quietly. "A long time ago." I swallowed hard. "You lied to me." "I didn't." He stopped, took a breath. "I just didn't tell you everything." "That's the same thing," I whispered. He reached for me, but I stepped back. Who is she? He exhaled slowly. My ex-fiancé. The words hit like cold water. I felt foolish, not because he had a past, but because I'd believed, even for a moment, that he saw me differently, that I wasn't just another secret. I should have told you, he said. You just what? My voice broke. Didn't think it mattered? Because I'm just the maid, right? His face twisted in pain. Don't say that. You know that's not true. But I didn't. Not anymore. I left before he could say another word. The rain had started by the time I reached the bus stop. Cold, relentless. I didn't bother opening my umbrella. I sat there, drenched, watching the city lights blur behind the raindrops. Every memory replayed in my head. Every laugh, every glance, every touch. All of it suddenly tainted by the question I couldn't stop asking. Was any of it real? By the time I got home, my daughter was asleep. I stood in her room, watching her breathe, her small chest rising and falling in the dim light. She looked so peaceful, untouched by the chaos that had become my life. And that's when the first tear fell, not for him, but for the part of myself I'd let believe again. The next few days passed in a haze. I went to work, but I kept my distance. He tried to speak to me once. I avoided him. He sent flowers. I didn't take them home. He left a note. I tore it before reading. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was tired. Tired of being someone's secret. Tired of being the woman men forgot how to see. But pain has a way of finding you, even when you hide. One evening, I returned to the mansion to collect my last paycheck. The house was quiet. The staff had gone home early. He was there, waiting by the piano. I didn't think you'd come, he said softly. I just came for what's mine. He nodded slowly. You mean your pay or the truth? I looked at him, fighting the tremor in my voice. Does it matter? It does to me. I didn't respond. He took a step closer. She showed up uninvited. I didn't plan any of this. I know, I said, but you didn't stop it either. He winced, like the words cut deeper than I intended. I didn't tell you who I was because I didn't want you to see me like everyone else does. Through money, mistakes, headlines. I shook my head. You wanted me to see you as someone you're not. No, he whispered. As someone I used to be, before everything got complicated. The silence stretched between us. Heavy. Final. Then, quietly, I said, maybe that's the problem. You keep looking backward. I don't have that luxury. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw regret. Raw and unguarded. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I know. My voice cracked. But you did anyway. I turned to leave, but he said my name, softly, almost like a prayer. When I looked back, he wasn't the same man I'd met weeks ago. He looked smaller, human, lost. Maybe that was what broke me most, knowing he hadn't lied out of cruelty, but out of fear. And yet, the damage was done. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of my small apartment felt too close, the silence too loud. I walked to the window, watching the lights of the mansion across the hill flicker faintly. Somewhere in there, he was probably doing the same, standing by his window, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I pressed my hand against the glass, whispering to no one, we could have been different. But the night didn't answer. Days turned into weeks. I found another job. Smaller house, simpler work. My daughter asked once if we'd ever see him again. I told her no. She nodded, accepting it more easily than I could. Still sometimes, when I passed by a cafe or a garden, I'd catch a glimpse of someone who looked like him. Tall, thoughtful, carrying that quiet kind of sadness. It was never him. But my heart always stopped anyway. Love, I learned, doesn't leave quickly. It lingers, in habits, in echoes, in the spaces where laughter used to live. One evening, as I was cleaning the windows of the new house, I found a folded piece of paper tucked behind the curtain. It was an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, Alexander Reed Foundation expands education program for single mothers. Beneath it was a small photo, him, smiling faintly at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I didn't know if it was coincidence or something more. But when I saw the date, my breath caught. It was 2 weeks after I'd left the mansion. For the first time in months, I felt something unfamiliar. Not pain, not regret. Something quieter, gratitude, maybe. Because maybe in his own way, he was trying to make things right. That night, I went for a walk. The city was glowing softly under the streetlights, and for the first time, the world didn't feel so heavy. I realized I wasn't broken, just healing, and healing takes time. When I returned home, my daughter was waiting with a drawing she'd made. A big house, 2 stick figures, a little heart between them. "Is that us?" I asked, smiling. She nodded. "And the man with the piano." I froze for a moment, then laughed softly. "You remember him?" She shrugged. "He was nice." I hugged her then, tight, maybe too tight, because she was right. For all his mistakes, he was nice. Just human, like me. I don't hate him. I never could. Some people enter your life to love you. Others enter to teach you. He was both. And though our story didn't end the way I once dreamed, it taught me the one thing I'd forgotten. That even after the fall, life goes on. And maybe, so does love. The apartment was quiet. So quiet, it almost felt unnatural. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, filling every corner with absence. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my daughter asleep in her room, and stared at the remnants of my old life. A stack of letters I had never opened, photographs with smudged edges, a lone apron folded neatly on the chair. All traces of a past that felt both distant and too immediate. For days, I barely spoke. The world outside moved on without me, but inside, time had stopped. Every ticking clock echoed like a drum in an empty hall. I walked through the apartment as if I were a ghost, touching objects only to remember they were mine. The memories of him came quietly, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a shock. His laughter, the warmth in his gaze, the way he had listened when no one else did. All of it lingered like sunlight trapped behind glass. And then the other memories came too. The lies, the secrets, the spaces where I'd been fooled into believing a story that wasn't mine to live. I realized then that the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of lessons I had to hear, full of truths I had to face. I used to think love was about being chosen, about someone else seeing you and deciding you were worth their time, their affection, their trust. I used to believe that love could fill the gaps inside you, but now I knew better. Love was about choosing yourself, about honoring the person you are, even when the world deceives you, even when someone you trust turns out to be only partially true. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe fully, not in the shallow way that comes from relief or escape, but in a deeper, conscious way, the kind of breath that reminds you that life still moves forward, no matter how heavy yesterday was. I began small, a walk in the morning sunlight, noticing the way it glinted on the leaves. I made coffee without rushing, letting the aroma curl lazily through the kitchen. I smiled at the barista at the corner cafe, a stranger, yet familiar in the small ritual of exchange. Each act felt deliberate, grounding me in the present, teaching me that my heart could still expand without fear of collapse. I even returned to cleaning, but now in homes that were quiet, small, lived in ways that reminded me of simple happiness. I noticed the details, the way a child's shoes were left by the door, the faint scent of dinner in the air, the warmth of sunlight spilling across a wooden floor. These were the textures of ordinary life, unguarded and sincere, and I realized I had been missing them while chasing illusions of grandeur and romance that weren't mine to claim. Sometimes, I would catch myself thinking of him, and I would smile softly, not with longing, but with understanding. He had been part of my journey, a mirror showing me my capacity to feel deeply, to hope, to trust. But he wasn't my future, not anymore. And that distinction, painful as it was, gave me clarity I hadn't known I needed. My daughter noticed the change before I did. She began asking to help with breakfast, insisting we water the plants together. "Look, Mommy," she said one morning, holding up a bright green leaf. "It's happy." And in that moment, I understood. Happiness didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered through small victories, quiet connections, ordinary mornings. I found joy in repetition, in rituals that once felt mundane. Folding laundry became an act of presence. Cooking dinner became an act of love. Even sweeping the floor was an opportunity to create order in a world that had felt chaotic. And yet, amidst all this, I carried the lessons of heartbreak with me. I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about releasing the burden, letting the anger, the disappointment, the ache drift away like autumn leaves on a river. Sometimes I would think back to the mansion, to the quiet mornings, to the piano by the window. I would remember the way he had looked at me, the way he had touched my hand, the laughter that had felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. It hurt, of course it did, but it also taught me resilience. And resilience, I realized, was a kind of rebirth. One morning, I decided to take my daughter to the park. The sky was pale blue, the trees shimmering in the gentle wind. She ran ahead, calling out to the squirrels, her laughter threading through the crisp air. I watched her, a cup of coffee warming my hands, and felt the weight of the past lift just a little. A woman at the fountain spilled her bag of groceries, and without thinking, I helped her gather the fallen items. We laughed together, strangers bound by a small act of kindness. And I noticed something. I was smiling without hesitation, freely, honestly. The kind of smile that reaches your eyes and your heart at the same time. It was a sign, subtle but powerful. I was stepping into the world again, not as someone half-broken, but as someone learning to trust her own strength. That afternoon, I sat at the window with my daughter drawing beside me. The sunlight fell across the room, illuminating the simple lines of our life. Our small apartment, our meals, our little routines. I realized that this quiet, ordinary life held more beauty than any mansion, any grand romance, any fleeting illusion ever could. Sometimes I would whisper to myself, "We're okay, we're really okay." And I believed it, because I had learned the truth. The heart could survive, could heal, could love again. Not someone else, not necessarily anyone else, but itself, and that was enough. I also understood the subtle gift of the lessons he had left behind. Sometimes the people who break us are the ones who teach us how to rebuild. Not out of cruelty, but out of inevitability. Their presence and their absence both serve to shape the person we are meant to become. I kept his newspaper clipping from the foundation somewhere tucked in a drawer. Not out of hope or longing, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the part of the journey he had shared with me. I didn't dwell on it. I didn't mourn it. I simply let it exist, a reminder that life moves forward in its own rhythm, with or without the people we once imagined would stay forever. Evenings became easier. I would linger in the kitchen after dinner, sipping tea, watching my daughter play. The room smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh laundry, small comforts I had learned to cherish. I read books again, letting words carry me into other worlds without fear of being left behind. And every night, when the apartment grew still and darkness wrapped around us, I would sometimes sit by the window and watch the city lights shimmer in the distance. The lights reminded me that life continues, unpredictable, unending, and beautiful in its imperfection. I didn't know if I would ever see him again. I didn't know if fate would weave our paths together once more. And I stopped trying to answer that question. Because the truth I had found, the quiet, steady truth, was that I could be whole on my own. I could be joyful, present, and loving, even in the absence of someone I had once believed might be my everything. One morning, as I made coffee and opened the window, the air felt different, lighter somehow. The city breathed around me, alive, indifferent, and yet welcoming. My daughter ran into the kitchen, hair tousled, eyes bright. She held my hand and tugged me toward the park. And I followed. I followed, knowing that each step forward was a choice I was making for myself. That each small act, a smile, a kind word, a shared laugh, was proof that the world still held light for me. I didn't need a grand gesture, a declaration, or a storybook ending. I just needed this: presence, love, and the courage to keep moving forward. I had survived the storm. I had loved and lost. I had fallen and risen again. And in that quiet, ordinary morning, I understood something profound. Life was mine to live, and love, real love, begins within. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, but if I do, I hope he's happy, because finally, I am too.